First 11 chapters of Genesis are basically early human history. It's Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. It's Noah and the flood. Then we get to Genesis 12 to about 25 is Abraham, and Genesis 26 through about 36. Isaac and Jacob are the main characters. And now here in Genesis 37, we get to the Joseph story. And really, the Joseph story is really super fascinating on a lot of different levels because you continue to see the theme of sibling conflict, the consequences of showing favoritism in a family when one parent loves one kid over the other ones. There are so many things here in this one that are just fascinating. Some familiar stories, maybe that we'll see from maybe a little bit of a different light as we work through it. But what's so interesting about this final section, Genesis 37 through 50, is it almost embraces a secular outlook on the history it tells. Like if you look at Genesis 1 through 36, you see God speaking, you see the name Lord all over the place. Like God is speaking to the patriarchs. The covenantal Lord is used a lot. You get to Genesis 37 through 50, God rarely speaks, if ever. And the covenantal name of Lord is rarely used compared to the first 36 chapters. It significantly drops off. It's a very different story. Some people have compared it almost to Esther. In that God is active, God is present, God is there, He's working, He's doing His job, He's faithful to His promises, but He's just not front and center like He was in the first 36 chapters. And so we're going to look at Joseph's story, starting there in verse 37, where we, surprise, see conflict in the family. Jacob, chapter 37 and verse 1, lived in the land where his father had stayed, in the land of Canaan. We see the family records of Jacob. That's a phrase that we've seen throughout the story. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended sheep with his brothers. And the young man was working with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought a bad report to their father. The word there, bad report, is also used to describe the report the 12 spies brought. All the way over in Numbers chapter 13 and 14. It's a malicious, it's a slandering report. He's basically being a tattletale here in verse 2. And then in verse 3, we find out that Israel loved Joseph more than his other sons because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age. And he made a long sleeve robe or a multicolored robe for him. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. What is the source of the conflict here in Jacob's family? Favoritism, that's one of it. How is it demonstrated? Jealousy and strife, yeah. What else? Jealousy, favoritism. What are some other sources of this conflict that's brewing here in this family? You can even skip down a couple of verses to what we're about to read. Jealousy, favoritism. What else? Does Joseph play a part in this? What's Joseph's role in this family conflict? Certainly, the brothers, the other 11, have their part, their role they play there. But does Joseph play a role in this conflict? How so?
Well, I don't know if I call him an instigator, but when he starts telling them about his dreams, that they're all going to bow down to him.
Yeah.
And he knows he doesn't like them.
Yeah. So Joseph's role here, there in the bad report, the implication, at least there in the original language, as I read this week in my studies, seems to indicate that he's not being fair. He's being a bit of a tattletale. And then when it comes to his dreams, it's not just, hey, you guys are going to bow down to me. Like, hey, this dream, I want to tell you about this crazy dream I had. Like, he's almost kind of like rubbing it in his faces. Like, he's continually telling them about his dream. It's almost like, hey, look at this dream. It's just really interesting because dreams in the ancient world meant something. Like you and I, we have a dream. We're going to talk about dreams a lot tonight, by the way. We have a dream. and by and large, they don't mean anything. Unless, hopefully, this has never happened to anyone in the room, your spouse wakes up and you did something bad in the dream, and all of a sudden you're now in trouble for something you allegedly did in a dream. That's never happened to anyone in here, but dreams usually don't mean anything. But in the ancient world, that's how God spoke to you. Kevin, I saw your hand waffling. What's going on?
I was just gonna say, I think like it's a good illustration of, I mean, because obviously the dreams we know did mean something. Like we know because we have the whole story that they were prophetic.
Yeah.
It's not unreasonable to think that the bad report he brought back of his brothers probably accurate based off of other behavior we've seen. So, like, I think it's a good illustration of, like, it's the truth, but he's kind of weaponizing that a little bit.
Yeah, and so that's kind of like the thing, like we often in our studies and the way we teach it, at least the way it was taught to me growing up, maybe it wasn't taught to you this way, is Joseph is almost pictured as like this picture perfect young man who's just trying to follow God. He's trying to obey God, and his brothers hate him and because he's just trying to do what's right. And the implication here is Joseph kind of plays a role in this conflict. He keeps rubbing in his face that he has his spot there, as Kevin's also brought up just a moment ago. Like, there's a lot going on here as he's telling them about his dreams there, that as Kevin rightly pointed out, they're going to turn out to be prophetic, and we're going to see that especially in the next couple of weeks there.
Sorry, I do want to say, though, it is not Joseph's fault that of what happens to him.
No.
Like, you can say that he has flawed behavior here, but he does not deserve what his brothers did to him. He's not at fault for what his brothers did to him.
But he does.
I think we need to be careful about how we phrase it and not blame him.
But he does play a role in the conflict.
Yeah.
Yeah. He is not an innocent bystander, and that's what I want us to see here. Is that he's not at fault when his brothers make the decision to throw him in the pit. We're going to see that in a moment. His brothers make that decision. He does not. But he doesn't help the situation with the way he acts. And sometimes maybe there's a little subtle lesson for us in conflict resolution. Like sometimes, even if we're not the cause of the problem, maybe we play a small role in understanding that and seeing that there. And so Joseph there has these dreams, and it causes the conflict there. And as Kevin pointed out a moment ago, what we're going to see over the next couple of chapters and even going into next week is really a battle between the dreamer and the dream killers here in the text, because these brothers have had enough there, starting in verse 12. They've had enough of his dreams. They're like, okay, let's get rid of him. Let's kill him. And so they make that decision to end up throwing him in the pit instead of killing him, and then eventually sell him into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. And they take off his robe, and this is just pausing here. This is the second time in Joseph's story already we've had a mention of his clothes. Pay attention to that over the next 13 or so chapters, because Joseph's clothes are going to play a pivotal role in his story. We saw one of the reasons for the conflict was that Joseph had a very special robe, and now when he's sold into slavery, they take the robe off of him, and they dip it in blood, and specifically goat's blood. And they take it to their father and tell him, verse 33, a vicious animal has devoured him, and Joseph has been torn to pieces. That Jacob is deceived by his own sons when they bring a garment that is covered in goat's blood. Can you think of another time in Jacob's life where he is involved with deception involving goats and a garment? Think back to earlier in his life when he deceives his own father, going to his father with a garment of goat's hair. Interesting. Whatever comes around, goes around. And so Jacob tears his clothes and puts on sackcloth, and he mourns his son many days. And his sons and his daughters tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. Verse 35, no, I will go down to Sheol to my son mourning. And his father wept for him. And meanwhile, verse 36, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, and the captain of the guard. Any other things you guys notice there in chapter 37 as we are going through Joseph's story? Anything else stand out to you about his story to this point?
I think it's just, I don't know that it's a huge point, but all of the players that have been introduced throughout Genesis, like Midian is one of the sons of Ishmael, I think.
Yeah.
So like, all these characters are getting introduced and then they're coming up again. Like Egypt was introduced way back, you know.
Yeah.
Like everything is kind of, you have all these family lines split and branch out, but then they're all weaving together to tell this story about God's covenant.
Yeah.
And so I do think it's important to like notice those connections and how things are those families are interconnected.
Yeah, you're right there, because as Moses is writing this hundreds of years later, he's talking or writing this for a people, and he's introducing them to their God and what their God has done. The technical term is polemic, but as an argument for the trueness and authenticity of their God, but also the background of their family history. And that's as a guy, I like family history. I'm intrigued by it for a lot of different reasons. But he's like, hey guys, this is who you are. This is where you come from. This is your story, that you're playing a part in this great grand scheme of redemption that God is working in human history. And you need to understand who these people are as you're coming in contact with them, who these nations and who these people.
And Moses himself flees to the Midianites.
Yeah.
When he runs away from Egypt.
And you're
so there's like this is a cycle that like this stuff keeps happening again and again.
You're going to see these people, and that's one of the things, to your point, Kevin, that I want us to see as we work through our Old Testament over the next couple of years, is that these cycles don't end with Genesis. That this idea of running to Egypt or running to the Midianites and trusting in other nations, this is not a cycle that ends in like at the end of Genesis. Like, you know, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they all like end up in Egypt for some reason. What does Israel end up doing in their history? Like late in their history, when Babylon's in power and Babylon's come to conquer them, what do they end up doing? Turning to Egypt and running to Egypt. Like these themes repeat themselves throughout the Old Testament. They don't stop, which is really cool. Lisa, I saw your hand up.
I was just thinking how the story, it keeps the theme going for me of like over and over again when you have problems in your life. You have a choice to take them to God, and most of the time in Genesis they don't, and they try. So when the boys are faced with this favoritism, they don't turn to God and say, I'm in this seemingly long-term life situation that's unfair.
Yeah.
They just try to solve matters on their own, usually with disastrous. Like they make problems worse for themselves, not better, you know?
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. That's an interesting observation to see this and all these problems that are happening in, you know, whether it's Abraham trying to take control of the situation with Hagar and having a kid that would become Ishmael, whether it's Isaac trying to orchestrate the promise and the birthright and the blessing and all this stuff we talked about a couple of weeks ago, whether it's Jacob trying to deceive everybody, or here with Jacob's sons and their conduct and their behavior. Like these people, as they're trying to live, they're not turning to God. They're living in many ways just like the Canaanites around them.
We're touching on what I was thinking about a little bit right now, in that the Bible is an amazing piece of literature in many, many ways. And one of the things that we have to contend with is sometimes we see God acting in ways that kind of confuse us, I think. thinking, for example, of the, when Israelites need to come out of Egypt and going to Pharaoh and asking him to get out, and he keeps saying no and no, and we're told that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And we say, what's God up to right now? And we see God acting with Abraham, for example. Some of the things that Abraham went to and got in the middle of were happening exactly as God wanted it to happen. God is in complete custody of this, of everything. Right here, all these events that happened to Joseph happened exactly the way God wanted it done. He had full custody of this, and yet we're left to grapple sometimes with, well, that's not going very well. How could God be in the middle of that? I think we need to wrestle with that a little bit from time to time to really understand God and what he's involved with, what he's doing, how he's acting in men's lives.
You know, as I think about what you're saying, though, one of the ideas that comes to my mind is just the power of our God. Mm-hmm. That even when man tries to stop the plan of God, let's just skip ahead in our Bibles to the New Testament, to Jesus, and man tries to stop the plan of God by crucifying the Messiah there on the cross, what does God do? He uses it to advantage. You crucified him, I'll raise him up. Like, you played right into my hands there. And yeah, Chris.
Well, two things. So first of all, I mean, 36 he does a lineage, and then 37 and 38, God's not mentioned anywhere.
Yeah.
Lord's not mentioned anywhere. Not mentioned until Joseph gets into Egypt, which I think is significant. I don't know how fully, but I do think that is the case. I also think that if you're God and the chess master, and you know every single move on the board, there's not a move that people throughout humanity can make that God doesn't have a counter to have his will done, to win. And so that's the thing that powers free will, is that when you're above it and have command of the entire board, the only thing that matters is, are you going to bend your will to God?
Yeah. And I'm glad I'm not the only one who thought of a chess piece. I don't know what that says about, our minds and the fact that I both went to a chess piece illustration. I didn't use it because I thought I didn't use it. But I love that idea. Like, every time man thinks I got God in a checkmate, God goes, no, I've got a counter. And that's what's so incredible about the story that we're seeing. And to your point, like, you don't see God mentioned or interacting specifically in 37, which is interesting for a lot of reasons, particularly because no one here in chapter 37 really exhibits noble character. At this point in Genesis, though, we're kind of used to it. For like the last 25 or so chapters, we've seen some people do some pretty horrendous things, even within the family of God. We've seen them lying, we've seen them cheating, we've seen them stealing, we've seen them doing all sorts of things within the family of God. And we see it once again when they sell their own brother into slavery. And what we're seeing that here, starting in verse 38, is that both Judah, or chapter 38, Judah and Joseph go down. Joseph goes down to Egypt. Judah goes down and settles near an Edomite named Hira. So they both leave the family. And so really quickly, let's compare and contrast the conduct of Judah and Joseph, particularly here in Genesis chapter 38 and 39. What do you guys notice about these two figures? Yeah.
I just kind of want to make some points before we get into that. One, it is. Well, so if if we're looking at Genesis as this story, we're following the thread of not who the protagonists are, but the covenant that God is creating, the promise, then, and we've been following it from child to child down these family lines. So once Jacob starts having all these kids, default assumption is it goes to the firstborn. However, we think that's not always been the case.
Mm-hmm.
And so the next thing you have happen is number 2 and 3. So not Reuben, Simeon, Levi. So Simeon and Levi, we're told about the specific account where they
Yeah.
slaughter all the people in Shechem.
Yeah.
And Jacob's mad at them. So as the reader, you're probably starting to guess like, all right, well, maybe not Simeon and Levi that are going to get the covenant, right? I think it's the next chapter. Then it drops, oh, Reuben sleeps with Jacob's concubine. Jacob's not happy about that.
Yeah.
So you're thinking, okay, probably not Reuben. So we've knocked out the first 3 sons. And so then the next thing you get is prophetic dreams about Joseph and his whole family bowing down to him.
Yeah.
So if you were going to bet at this point in the story,
Yeah.
who's going to get the covenant, it's
Yeah.
definitely Joseph. And so you're just kicking into Joseph's story, and then it's like, hold the brakes. Let's
Yeah.
jump back to number 4, son number 4, and we're going to talk about Judah now.
Yeah.
And so I think like it's really important to keep following that, because like this chapter I think to me is so critical to the
Yeah.
whole
It,
arc of Genesis.
And I'm glad you kind of caught the here, because it does provide here in like Genesis 37 through 41 almost like narrative whiplash, if I can use that illustration. Because like you just pointed out, Simeon and Levi, you're out. Reuben, you're out. You get to Joseph, dreams, he's the dude. Chapter 38, it's all about Judah. Like we go from Joseph going down to Egypt to Judah and his going down and having all his problems. And then we're back to Joseph. Like, what's going on here?
And once you finish reading this chapter, it's almost as though to confirm for sure it's not Reuben, it's not Simeon, it's not Levi, it's definitely not Judah.
Yeah. And so, kind of keep what Kevin's saying, like, as we're comparing and contrasting the conduct of Judah and Joseph, because he's brought up some things. So let's just think about this. Compare and contrast the two. What are some similarities? What are some differences between these two characters that we read here in Genesis 38 and 39? What do you see in these two characters? What are some similarities in their stories or their characteristics or their traits? What are some differences?
Joseph is involuntarily removed from his
Yeah.
family. Judah apparently decides that,
Yeah.
for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Understandable, I think, for him at this point.
Yeah.
Like, that he's like, I'm done with this family.
Yeah. So
Live my own way.
they both go down. They both leave the family. Kevin's right. One's voluntarily, one's involuntarily. What's another similarity or difference there in the story? And you can even skip ahead to chapter 41 if you want. What about property? Genesis 37, Joseph's property, his coat, is taken from him and is offered as evidence of his demise. There in Genesis chapter 38, Judah's property, his seal and his cord and his staff are used as proof of his sin and his transgression with Tamar. There in chapter 39, once again, Joseph's property, his garment, there's that Joseph in clothes thing, is used as evidence that Joseph tried to sleep with Potiphar. That's one parallel. What else do you guys see there? Have you ever considered the possibility that while Judah is living it up away from his family there in Genesis chapter 38, that Joseph is down in Egypt as a slave? That these are almost parallel chronologically in terms of the timeline? That what we read here in Genesis chapter 38 and what we read there in Genesis chapter 39, while Judah's down here and he's living around these Canaanites and he's marrying these Canaanites and his kids are acting like Canaanites. And the Lord, verse 7 and verse 10 of chapter 38, is putting his kids to death. Joseph is down, surrounded by Egyptians, trying to live faithfully. That's interesting to me. And to kind of build on the point that Kevin brought up a moment ago about Judah and Joseph, it looks like Joseph's going to be the child of promise. And what we see, even as the story progresses, is that God blesses one, Joseph, and punishes the other, Judah, by killing his two sons. that both, while they're down away from the family, have two sons. In Judah's case, he has two sons twice. He has the two sons that die, and then he has a third. And then he ends the chapter with the two sons from the rape of Tamar that we've talked about briefly, just big picture, or has come up briefly. Joseph, at the end of his, like this story tonight, has two sons. That's interesting. What else? Do you guys see any other comparisons or contrasts or similarities or differences between these characters?
I know we kind of talked about like that God's silent in these chapters. I don't think that we should dismiss the dreams that Joseph has, because those are definitively prophetic. And it sort of sounds like Joseph was taking them as being prophetic.
No.
And then with Judah, his first two sons are killed, and Judah understands that to be by God.
Yeah.
So I don't know if God was telling him that, word for word, but God is directly acting on both of them, and both of them recognize his hand.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
but God is acting, I guess my point was that they're not acting to God.
Yeah.
Right, they're not sort of, Joseph takes what God has shared, what I do believe God shared with him, and uses it to kind of hold it over his brothers.
It's not a two-way
And
communication.
then the only other thing is, Judah has a couple of horrible sons that God says, I can't even have you here.
Yeah. And to kind of reply to Kevin, there is a difference, at least in 37 through 50, in how God communicates. At least the way I understand it. That in Genesis, going all the way back to Adam and Eve in the garden, God spoke to Adam. He spoke. Or he even came down in human flesh and talked to Abraham in the three figures there right before, I think it's Genesis 18. Like God spoke directly. There was conversations happening, two-way, one-way conversations sometime, where God speaks to Jacob or to Isaac. But here, God is not directly speaking himself. He speaks through the dreams. And that's a subtle, interesting difference, I think, as you see the story progress, to think about how God is changing how he communicates to his people, at least for the time being there. Any other thoughts all the way to chapter 38? As we see the people of God continue to act like anything but the people of God, and the rape of Tamar there in the text. And there in chapter 39, that famous story about Joseph in Potiphar's house and the temptation that he faces, that while Joseph is down in Egypt and he's working for a guy named Potiphar, we see there in verse 2 that the Lord was with Joseph. And again in verse 3, the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything he did successful. And as a result, Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his entire household and placed all that he had under his authority. And from the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian house because of Joseph. And the Lord's blessing was on all that he owned, in his house and in his fields. Think back for just a moment to that promise to Abraham there in Genesis chapter 12. What's one of those promises to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12? That I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. What do we see here in chapter 5? God is faithful, or chapter 39, verse 5. God is faithful to his promises, that he is blessing those who are blessing Joseph. And there in verse 36, we see a little, as we've talked about in previous classes, a little hint that something bad's about to happen. There in verse 6, that he left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome. Think back to what we've seen in the Genesis story to this point. 38 chapters of it. when we see someone described physically, what usually happens? When Adam and Eve are in the garden and they see the fruit hanging on the tree, how is the fruit described? How was that fruit described in Genesis 3? It's described as beautiful or pretty or in positive terms. Yeah. Depends on your translation. And then in Genesis chapter 12, when Abraham goes down to Egypt, how is Sarah described? As beautiful. So when we read the Genesis story and someone is described in very positive physical terms, like neon lights need to be going off because it's almost like a sign from the writer that something bad is about to happen. And what's interesting about the way Joseph is particularly described here in the text in verse 6 is it's the same words, in Hebrew at least, as his mom. That both Rachel and Joseph are the only ones to be described as both well-built, or the female version of that, and handsome. Some people are described as beautiful, but not well-built. Some have one or the other, but they are the only two in the Genesis account that have both. So like right now, neon lights need to be flashing in our eyes because we see this trend, this pattern, this motif popping up again. Because in verse 7, after some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." Yes, Steve.
You just piqued my interest. Everything leads back to Isaiah.
Yeah.
In Isaiah 53, the Savior is described as someone with no form or comeliness.
Yeah.
Exactly the opposite of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Kind of interesting.
Yeah. You see that again. Like skipping ahead to, you see Isaiah 53, which is a contrast to, spoiler, we've been going through Saul in our sermons on Sunday. Saul is described as what? Handsome as well. A contrast. Like, you see these things. I'm glad you're noticing these parallels and these contrasts as we're reading the story, because I think they're there for a reason as we're reading. We're supposed to see these types and these antitypes, these comparisons and these contrasts. All these characters are supposed to kind of like foil and compare each other. They're supposed to get us to think about it. And so here in Genesis chapter 39, Joseph, this handsome man who's living in a faraway land, whose master says, or master's wife says, "Sleep with me." He says, "Okay, whatever. That's what you're supposed to do, right? Because you're an Egyptian in a foreign land, and in that day and in that time, if you were a slave in someone's house, and they said, 'I need you to sleep with me,' male or female, that was your job. You were there to gratify their desires. Ancient laws had laws about what to do when the slave got the master pregnant, or when the master got a slave pregnant. We see that in ancient history. And Joseph is faced with this temptation. So how does he respond to this temptation in Genesis chapter 39? What jumps out to you about his response to this temptation that he's facing? He's a young man in Egypt, far away from home, facing this temptation. What jumps out to you? How did his brother respond? Yeah, correct.
Well, I think he tries to remove himself from the situation. But then he demonstrates his loyalty to Potiphar as well as his loyalty to God. So
He tries to remove himself, loyalty to God, loyalty to Potiphar, and you see that in his response. I'm not going to violate my master's wife, loyalty to his master. I'm not going to violate this loyalty, verse 9, to God. What else jumps out to you? Again, comparing him back to Joseph, or to Judah, excuse me. All these J names tonight. How did Judah respond to temptation? The same kind of temptation. How did Judah respond?
Immediately fell for it.
Immediately fell for it. How does Joseph respond? I can't do this. I'm not going to sin against God. Again, these two are in many ways a foil, a contrast to one another there in the text. And she comes after day, verse 10. This is not a one-time temptation where she comes up and says, sleep with me, and he says, not today. It's day after day after day after day after day. She is trying to wear him down, and he won't wear down. He won't give in. And so one day when it's just her and him, she grabs him by, verse 12, the garment and said, sleep with me. And he left his garment in her hand and ran out of the house. Joseph did not listen to the temptation of the woman. Think about how many times in the Genesis story a major figure has listened to the temptation of a woman. Can you name a couple? Adam is one. What's another? Samson's later in the story, yes, but I'm talking specifically the Genesis story. Adam listened to the voice of his wife.
Probably
Abraham is the other that I can think of at least very quickly in terms of listening to the voice of their wife. Here, Joseph, as he's in a faraway land, faced with this temptation, does not listen to the voice of this woman and instead leaves his garment behind. And she uses that very garment that he left behind to maintain his purity and his faithfulness to God. He left it behind, and she uses it against him. And he's thrown in prison. Anything you see there to verse 20? Any comments, questions, concerns, thoughts? Yeah.
Going back to chapter 38 with Tamar, I see between Potiphar's wife and Tamar where both of them are using garments.
Yeah.
And Tamar used those garments to prove her that she was indeed who she was, and Judah didn't recognize her.
Yeah.
And yet, I just find it interesting that she was chosen, her offspring was chosen for the genealogy of Christ.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how is that connected, but it's just interesting that Joseph wasn't chosen.
Let's pause there just for a second. I'm glad you brought up that it's, Kevin brought up the comment a moment ago that in this point in the story, it looks like Joseph's going to be the child of promise, and we're going to find out later in the Genesis story that it's going to be Judah, it's going to be the son of promise, and that's who the Messiah is going to come to. And the Messiah is going to come through specifically the offspring of Judah's adulterous and sinful relationship with Tamar. Now, really quickly, skip ahead to Matthew chapter 1. In your minds or in your Bibles, Matthew chapter 1. When you see the genealogy of Jesus, how many women are in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1?
4, 5,
5. Tamar, Ruth, Rahab, Bathsheba, Mary. Now think about those women's backgrounds for a second. Tamar played the prostitute. Ruth came from a nation that was known for its sexual immorality. She was a Moabite. Rahab was a prostitute. Bathsheba had her son, through which Jesus came, as a result of a relationship with David that she should not have had, her sinful relationship, or David's rape, we'll call it that way, David's rape of Bathsheba. And then Mary, the virgin. You see the interesting how these details add up? And they play a role? That out of this messed up family and this messed up genealogy comes the Savior of the world. mean, that's looking like 1,500, 2,000 years ahead, but that's what it's going to lead to. And so Joseph is sent down to Egypt. He is in prison in Egypt, but the irony of the Joseph story is that the closer he gets to prison, the closer he gets to the palace. Because it's while he's there in prison, the Lord is still being kind to Joseph. And he grants Joseph favor with the prison warden. The warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority. The warden, verse 23, did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything he did successful. And while he's there in the prison, he has these dreams, or he doesn't have the dreams. He comes across the baker and the cupbearer, and they have the dreams, and they're startled, and they're wrestling with it because you're an ancient Egyptian, and you believe that dreams come from the gods. And so the gods are trying to speak to you. What's going on? What is the gods trying to teach me? And Joseph speaks up. And look how Joseph responds. Even while he's in prison, he says, don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. He is in the pits. In Genesis chapter 37, where does his story go? His story went to the pits. That he is thrown in a cistern. That now he is in a prison. He is in the pits once again. And yet his faith in God has not wavered. And they tell him the dreams, and he tells the cupbearer, here's what's going to happen to you. That in 3 days you're going to be raised back up to your old position. Baker's excited because he's like, hey, he got good news. Maybe I'm going to get good news too. So he tells Joseph the dream, and Joseph says, I got bad news for you. 3 days you're going to be dead. And it happens just as Joseph predicted. And even when it did, the cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot. Sometime later, 2 years later, chapter 41 and verse 1, Pharaoh had a dream. And Pharaoh is, in the Egyptian mind, a god. And as a god, he has the ability to understand the mind or the will of the god. So Pharaoh should be able to interpret this dream that he has about 7 healthy, well-fed cows coming up from the Nile. They begin to graze, and they're eaten by 7 sickly cows. And then he wakes up, and that would startle most of us. For some reason, that's a weird dream to have. And then he falls asleep again and has another dream about 7 plump, good heads of grain, and they're eaten by 7 thin, scorched by the east wind heads of grain. And he is startled. And the cupbearer goes, oh God, I forgot. There's a guy in prison who can interpret this dream. And so Joseph is called, and in verse 14, he is shaved, and his clothes are changed. And he goes to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I have said about you that you can hear a dream and interpret it. Look how Joseph responds to Pharaoh, the most powerful person in the ancient world at the time. I am not able to. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is God who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And so Pharaoh tells Joseph the dreams, and then Joseph interprets the dreams. That the interpretation of the dreams is that you're going to have 7 great years. 7 phenomenal years. And then you're going to have 7 awful years. 7 years of famine. And then he offers this proposal to Pharaoh. He says, okay, you're going to have 7 years of plenty, 7 years of surplus. Take from the surplus and set it aside so that way when the famine comes, you'll have food. And so Pharaoh does it. And in verse 38, it said, can we find anything like this? A man who has God's Spirit in him? And in verse 39, since God has made all of this known to you, there is no one as discerning and wise as you are. You will be over my house, and all my people will obey your commands. Only I, as king, will be greater than you. And Pharaoh also said to Joseph, see, I am placing you over all the land of Egypt. He removed his signet ring and placed it on his hand, that's Joseph's hand, and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him with fine linen garments, and placed a gold chain around his neck. There it is again, Joseph's clothes. And he rides in the chariots. But really quickly, as we're thinking about the Joseph story up until this point, we've seen a lot of him in prison and whatnot. How does Joseph respond to injustice and suffering in his life? There in Genesis 39 and 40. He is literally in prison. He is innocent. It is unjust to be in prison when you're innocent. How does he respond to that injustice and suffering? Not a complaint. Like, we can say all we want about Joseph and maybe egging on his brothers in Genesis 37, but how he handles injustice is incredible. Yeah, Lisa, what's going on in your head?
When he was in prison, when it says the Lord was with him and showed steadfast love to him, imagine that was like something clear that was comforting Joseph.
Yeah.
So like God, he knew God was with him. He wasn't, so they were in prayer, he was meditator,
Yeah.
God comforted him like it was, you know how like, I forget, Kim Winston, when she was here, taught a class on prayer and said it's a full circle. It's not just you praying and getting nothing back. It's the full circle of praying and God responding to you.
Yeah.
Joseph clearly had the full circle
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
able to be comforted by God when he was in this bad situation.
And that's a good point. Like, he's sitting there, and you have to wonder just for a second if Joseph was like sitting here, is like, this is not how I thought my life would go. I did not think I would find myself in a pit, sold by my brothers in slavery into Egypt, thrown into prison. Like, does God care about me? Has God forgotten me? I know the promises God made to my family. Like, has God completely forgotten me? And he's praying, he's seeking God, and he's seeing God work, and he's reminded God hasn't forgotten. I think that's important. Yeah, Chris.
So first of all, I think Lisa brings up a good point. Because in that scripture it says, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper. So I think there's an intervention going on. And Joseph is diligent to be faithful to God and do the work. I don't think that means he didn't have a down moment.
No.
I just want to, I think sometimes we deify Joseph, and, you know, this is the same Joseph who had the dream and said, hey, brothers, check out what's happening. I don't think that, but that's not the point. The point is that God is with him and that he is faithful to God. And therefore, he finds favor and confidence from the person in charge. Yeah. I just think sometimes we might go too far.
Yeah, and that's a good thought for us, that Joseph probably had some Debbie Downer moments in a pit, in prison. But his confidence wasn't in his situation. His confidence was in his relationship with God. In fact, if you have the ESV, which it sounds like Lisa and Chris are using tonight, it's that word steadfast love. The Hebrew word behind it is the word that's used to describe that covenantal, faithful love that God has with his people. So Hesed, depending on how you spell it in English, it's either C-H-E-S-E-D or H-E-S-E-D, is how it's transliterated in English. And so, Joseph's down in Egypt, and while he's there in Egypt, he goes from prisoner to prince. This is important to think about in terms of the promises of God. What was one of God's promises to Abraham back in Genesis 17 and verse 6? This is one we don't often think about. Genesis 17 and verse 6.
All nations will be blessed.
All nations will be blessed. We're going to see that play out, especially with the famine, when the nations come to Egypt for food, the breadbasket of the world. That nations are blessed through the wisdom of Joseph and his forethought and his planning there. So certainly we're about to see that even more so. One of the promises there is that kings will come from you. What do we see here? Joseph is prince. Joseph is royalty. that we're starting to see maybe a down payment, if you'll allow me to use that term, on that promise. Certainly Joseph is not the final prince, the final king that will come from Joseph's or Abraham's family, but he does seem to be playing a pivotal prince-like role in this moment at the story.
Well, in Genesis 35, he says the same thing to Jacob.
Yeah.
He says, kings are gonna come from your
You're
line.
fine. Lisa, I see your hand.
Yeah, I'm thinking too about the question on the board. When Joseph is elevated above his brothers, he's 16, 17 years
Yeah.
old. He doesn't have the wisdom and maturity to respond the way he should. And then fast forward, 20, 30 years of his life, and he's elevated from the prisons to second in command for the whole kingdom.
Yeah.
And he has an opportunity, again, to have people be unhappy with his elevation and be jealous of him and envious, and he has a second chance with some wisdom and God's guidance to do that better the second
Yeah.
time.
That's an interesting thought that he goes from beloved son to prisoner to prince. Beloved son, humbled to the lowest form of man, to prince. Beloved son, humbled, prince. Are you seeing a pattern here? Do we see that story elsewhere in Scripture? Who am I talking about? Who else parallels that story? Jesus. There are a lot of people who have seen multiple parallels between Joseph's story and the story of Jesus.
Well, there's a famine arc in here as well, which is, first of all, the famines were a big deal. I mean, the supply chain, and we've seen the supply chain of gas break just recently, and we're just going, but now imagine a food supply chain that was very much dependent on crops and on seasons and on things happening. And so what he brings here, but everything that happens from this point forward is driven by that famine. The boy sent down, coming back, we're gonna deal, dad come here.
Yeah.
It's all driven by that one epic, prolonged event.
Yeah.
And it just harkens back to the complexities of living. We talk about the simplicity of living at that time, but the complexities of living at that time and what people had to go through. And I think that's one of the reasons why when you get down later in the verse, I think it's verse 346, which is where he says, no, go down to Egypt. I got you covered.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing that God uses. Once Joseph is elevated, God uses this famine to get everybody in Egypt. And this was important for the story to progress, because in Egypt, in Goshen, Israel could become a nation because they were shepherds, and Egyptians don't like shepherds. And so that allowed them the opportunity to grow and to thrive in a land of their own by themselves. And so God is using these events in history to accomplish his divine purpose. And I'm glad you brought up the famine and just the human aspect of a famine. I want to go back in your minds like 5 years ago, because 5 years ago what was happening in our world? 6 years ago.
Toilet paper.
Toilet paper crisis. It was COVID. Yeah. Y'all remember, I don't know how it was here in terms of the grocery stores, but in Jackson, where Alice and I lived, I can remember waking up, it seems like every morning, it probably wasn't every morning, and running to the grocery store to try to get whatever I could off the counter, because we may not be able to get ground beef. We may not be able to find toilet paper. We may not be able to find chicken. And so I would go like every morning and run down there, put on the mask, run down there, and get whatever I could, because I didn't know the next time I'd be able to get chicken if I didn't get it that morning. That might have been my freaky weirdness, doomsday prepper side. But we've seen those supply chains challenge, whether it's the gas, whether it's COVID challenging our food supply chains. In the ancient world, famines were deadly. We don't understand that today, because even in COVID, we still were able to find food. It may have been ramen noodles, but we were still able to find food somewhere. In the ancient world, famines were awful. They were deadly. and a famine that lasted 7 years, think about how low your reserves were after 7 years. And so Joseph is quite literally, as Kevin anticipated a moment ago, a blessing to the nations because he and his divine wisdom that God has granted him and preparing, telling him about this famine, set aside food so that the nations could stream to God's family and be fed. Does that sound familiar? These themes, these motifs that we see in Scripture keep getting repeated over and over and over again. Sometimes it's in a major key and sometimes it's a minor key, but they keep getting repeated. And I think that's really, really cool. And I hope you'll continue to see that. Any final comments, questions, all the way to the end of chapter 41 as we've kind of gone through this story and kind of really done a survey, almost a theological approach to Joseph's life here in the text. Any final thoughts, comments, or questions? Okay. On that note, it is 8 o'clock, and so class is dismissed.